Yeah, sure. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me, Jim, because today I get to talk about something that I'm incredibly passionate about. So yeah, I'm Marianne Patton. I am a senior research technician here at UQ with the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences. Many years ago, before the dot-com crash, I worked for the same IT research centre as Jim and Michael. And I worked for a brief amount of time with the security unit. So my story involves a bit of hacking, and I guess I'm fairly interested in that whole white hat hacker movement, and that's part of the reason I'm interested in the We Are Not Waiting movement. But mostly today, I'm speaking about do-it-yourself artificial pancreas technology from a personal perspective, because I've lived with type 1 diabetes for 39 years now. And the reason I've got a photo of myself here as a 14-year-old is really goes back to when I was diagnosed with diabetes in 1980. I was given a book, and in that book, it had a diagram, a circuit diagram of a bionic pancreas. And scientists were apparently working on this, and apparently it was going to be 5 years till we had it. And I really didn't enjoy diabetes. I hated diabetes. And so I used to kind of study that diagram all the time. And then by about this age, age 14, the penny dropped, because when you're 12, you just believe everything. But by 14, I realised that it was nowhere near, going to happen by the time I was 18. So I've currently been using a do-it-yourself artificial pancreas system. I've used 3 of them in the last year and a half. So for me, it actually is living a life dream. So first of all, does anybody here have type 1 diabetes or have a family member with type 1? No? Okay, so I'm not sure how much you know about it, but there's quite a few different presentations of diabetes, but the sort of diabetes I was diagnosed with as a child is an autoimmune disease. So my body just decided to attack the beta cells, which live in that funny shaped organ there, the pancreas. And the beta cells are responsible for producing insulin, and insulin is an incredibly important hormone for the body. So if we have a look at the biomolecular kind of angle for all this, what happens is you eat food and carbohydrates, and they're broken down, or I suppose I need to use this little pointy thing, into these little sugar cube shaped molecules, which are glucose molecules. And you can also see the insulin molecule there, which is the blue one. So in your bodies, you've got precisely the right amount of insulin is generated by your body in the pancreas to match whatever food you've eaten, whatever glucose you have in your body. So if you look, there's that one there. At this diagram, you can see at the cellular level, there's the insulin molecule sitting on a receptor, and that actually tells this transportation system to open up and allows the glucose to go into the cell. And it's used for energy, or if it's not going to be used for energy, it's turned into fat. So in people with type 1, you can see down here, we've got no insulin molecule. So therefore, the glucose just builds up in the blood. Now, over time, if you've got too much sugar in your blood, it's not very good for your body. So that's where we hear the awful headlines about kidney disease, blindness, amputations. It's all a bit dire. Usually takes many years to develop, but I guess diabetes type 1 is a very serious condition if you can't maintain your blood glucose levels within a nice narrow range. So yeah, what do you think the hardest part about type 1 diabetes might be? No wrong answer. Yeah, it's huge impact on your lifestyle, because I think I think they've worked out that people with diabetes have about 300 decisions to make every day in order to keep their blood sugars in that healthy range. And it was always a maths game, really. So it's the perfect medical condition to lend itself to automation and digitisation. But just, so it just destroys the spontaneity of your life to some extent. So this was what life was like before insulin. So before 1922, people basically just faded away and died. They were put on starvation diets. This is a boy who's been given, a little 3-year-old boy given insulin in 1923, and within 3 months he's back looking like a regular, plump, healthy boy. So this is what the therapy was like in 1980 when I was diagnosed. The top is actually a photo used in 1935. The therapy hadn't really changed much by 1980. We were giving ourselves one long-acting injection of insulin a day. So that insulin's absorbed in this really sort of slow, reasonably steady manner. And we, actually, if I look at the next slide, the only way we could sort of manage our therapy was to try and do what's on the bottom there, which is try and have these 6 small meals a day. So if it got to 10 a.m. and you weren't able to eat your morning tea snack, hello, you know, diabetics were always really freaked out about time because we had insulin operating in the background, which we couldn't control because we'd given an injection at 10 o'clock the night before. And if we didn't keep eating throughout the day, we could end up in potentially quite dangerous situation of hyperglycemia. And hyperglycemia is when you've got too much insulin, not enough sugar, and it feels like a panic attack. You shake, you sweat, become really confused, and some people actually lose consciousness. So that's what the therapy was like. And the only way we could get a handle on what the sugar was doing or how much sugar we had in our body was urine testing. So once you had too much sugar, it would actually flow out into your urine. So you can imagine for this thing that really should have been very precise, this was really the only great colour to get. But you got this colour regardless of whether you were in a very healthy blood sugar range or whether you're in severe hypoglycemia. So a lot of us kind of, I'm not very good with this, a lot of us really liked our sugars to be in the green, but the green wasn't ideal. It actually meant that we had too much sugar than what was healthy. So the first real invention in my life was going from glass syringes with reusable needles to plastic syringes. And then we got the home blood glucose monitor. So we could prick our fingers and work out precisely how much glucose we had in our blood. So this was actually good. When you look at diabetes outcomes, there is much better long-term outcomes for people with diabetes once we had these blood glucose monitors. But then in 1993, we had a pivotal trial that was kind of good, but was also pretty awful because it showed us that we really, really needed those healthy blood sugars. Until 1993, plenty of doctors would say, oh, just do your best, you'll be right. But we really knew that we had to keep the blood sugars really finely controlled. And the sort of recommendations we were given were very tricky because they meant that you had quite a lot of hypoglycemia. And I think to keep your levels as much as possible in the healthy range, you would have 1 episode per year of a hypoglycemic event that you couldn't recover from yourself. You needed someone to rescue you. So these are really tricky things to manage. Oh, yeah, please ask questions, any questions. Trying to keep your blood sugar between 3.9 millimoles per litre and 10 millimoles, because at that level, that's pretty close to what your body would do. But unfortunately, because of 42 different factors that affect blood glucose, there's just no way you could keep your sugar levels like that given the therapy, which was, by that stage, was multiple daily injections. We had 1 long-term injection per day, slow acting, and we had 3 injections for meals. The insulin would peak anywhere between 2 and 4 hours. So you can already see by that there's all this room to get things wrong. So I guess Yes.
Very high. One of the things is techniques trying to understand what's happening on the inside of the cell rather than the blood. So a lot of folks in the literature is actually about blood sugar. The only reason we measure blood sugar is we don't actually have a way of measuring intracellular level. That's important. If you don't have enough insulin, the sugar levels inside the cells are low, they don't function. That means your kidney cells don't function, your eye cells don't function, your brain cells don't function, no cells. And that's what it. If you have, and then when that happens, the sugar which is there in the bloodstream goes up and up and up. Conversely, if you have too much insulin and not enough food, you run out of sugar, and then inside the cells, it's also. So in both ends of the spectrum, the thing inside the cell has low sugar. Why decisions of hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia are quite similar, because what's actually happening inside the cell is identical. It's not enough.
Yeah.
Getting the balance between the sugar intake, food intake on the one hand, and the insulin intake, if you've got too much insulin, then it depletes the cell's overall sugar rather than going out.
Yeah.
If you have not enough insulin, you're still can't get it yourself.
No, that's really good. And yeah, so there's the only place you want to be is in between, in that Goldilocks zone. Yes, I guess until then we did not have irrefutable proof that high blood sugars led to diabetic complications. So they did put out recommendations. The problem is if we really examine them, what they were doing was, in a sense, creating a situation where it was better, regarded as better for people to have more hypos, although that was never really stated. I mean, ideally you didn't want people to have any hypos, but the people that they put on the intensive monitoring did have 300% more hypos and there were several fatal car accidents, and there were, there was that one severe hypoglycemic event per year. So I guess everyone had to do their own juggling. Insulin pens, really, it's just a dressed up syringe. I remember it was a bit less stigma to take to shoot up with a pen when you're having a meal, but I still remember my friend saying, "Why are you stabbing your leg with a pen?" And this is my happy slide. There's Michael there. So this is in 2000. This was the first breakthrough that I really liked, which was the insulin pump. You had to be connected to a device. I mean, as you can see, it hasn't really progressed a lot in those 19 years. It still looks like a really bad pager. But this meant we could get away from the long-acting insulin and just give ourselves short-acting insulin. And we could try and set the basal or background amounts of that to match more closely what our bodies were doing. And all my friends thought this was great. Suddenly I had this thing controlling my diabetes, but it really was still pretty dumb because it wasn't reacting to anything. It was, I had to put everything, every time I ate, I had to tell the pump how much insulin to give me. It wasn't, it was still a fairly blunt tool. Absolutely all of the decisions. And then we had blood glucose meters that obviously got smaller. And this is when we get into the era of proprietary software. So, for instance, on my pump, I have something called a bolus calculator. It's very handy for that bolus calculator to automatically find out what my latest, or to get a recent blood sugar. But only the pump company I was with only worked with one type of blood glucose meter, so that the value went from the BG meter directly to the pump. It might sound like a small thing, but when you're interacting with that system many times a day, just even having that glucose value automatically populate your other device is a very useful thing. But we end up being sort of locked into using particular products based on usually which insulin pump we had if we wanted that functionality. So you couldn't always get the most accurate system. There were other things in there that were really interesting too, like the bolus wizard. I didn't trust it. It didn't work for me. I usually ended up with hypoglycemia after I used it. Partly that's because the parameters I had entered in weren't right for me. And you think yeah, you just sort that out. But it's a lot harder to pull apart all the details than you might think. Now that I'm using this do-it-yourself open source solution, I know exactly what I need. But prior to that, my data was just, to me, one big mess. Also, when I entered into my bolus wizard, I entered something called insulin sensitivity factor, which is how much will my blood sugar drop if I have 1 unit of insulin. My pump always alarmed me. I don't know where the cutoff point was, but if I said 5, 1 unit will drop my blood sugar 5 millimoles. The system alarmed me or alerted me to the fact that that was way more sensitive than what was normal, although it was valid. So I eventually got up to 7. So 1 unit would drop me by 7. But every time you're entering something into the system, you get that alert, and that's a little bit disconcerting. So what I've discovered since looping, DIY looping, using open source, is that my insulin sensitivity factor is actually 10. So it's no wonder, looking back on it, that I was having hypos. And that's just interesting that the alerts were set at a particular level. So it just reminds us that to think carefully before we put alerts into a system. So yeah, we had, this is a continuous glucose monitor that was developed. The first one that came into wide use was in about 2012. This is a Dexcom, which has been extremely reliable. Going back to my pump, this pump, if I wanted to use a continuous glucose monitor to interact with my pump, I was locked into using this company's CGM. I did try that CGM, but it actually gave me errors. So once it suspended my insulin when my blood glucose was about 14, and that's potentially quite dangerous because you actually need insulin to bring the sugar down. So I didn't want to be locked into using that CGM. I wanted my choice of CGM. I couldn't justify the cost because it was over $100 a week out of pocket to use this. But in the United States, a lot of people started using this continuous glucose monitoring device because they were able to get rebates through their private health insurance. And then we get the next issue, which was it was locked in. It had proprietary software as well. And your blood sugars went to this receiver, but they didn't go to the cloud. They didn't go anywhere else. So you had to have a receiver with you. And I'm not sure how many hours of data they gave you in that, but you know, this was incredibly frustrating. As you can tell, people like yourselves, maybe who had diabetes around 2012, got really, really frustrated that they couldn't have all the data they needed in one place. So, you know, we all had drawers like that full of all our downloading cables and all the proprietary, whatever they were, mic USBs. I think we had a CareLink USB. So I did what a lot of people did, and even in, you know, up until 2 years ago, I was writing my blood sugar levels into a notebook and documenting when I ate, how much carbohydrate I ate, and things like that, which is a little bit sad given it was 2017. But that's because I had no way to pull all my data together. So this, if I did use my digital system, this is all that was available to me. There was one view for the doctor and one view for the patient, which is really awkward in diabetes because you see the doctor for 15 minutes 4 times a year, but you're managing your diabetes yourself all the time. So this is my blood glucose data over a 2-week period. And to me, that just looked like a really big mess. So you can see, for instance, this at 12 o'clock on one day, I was in hypoglycemia there. That's below 3.9. But at 12 o'clock on another day, my blood sugar was up. I don't know what that is, but it's up in the teens. And we've got a 20, up towards 20 here versus probably around 5. So there was, I couldn't detect any patterns in it. And whilst perhaps a medical profession might say the problem is you, with the right tools, I've been able to completely turn that around. So, and this just shows why, some of the 42 reasons that it's really hard to control blood sugar levels. So you can try and get the amount of carbohydrate right, but you can't always work it has a different absorption depending on whether there's fat in the meal. Your insulin can be absorbed differently depending on where your insulin's being injected. Caffeine, alcohol, stress, hormones. So for instance, with that old software, I really wanted to be able to put sort of hormonal cycle information into that, because for 3 days of the month, I would need double the amount of insulin that I would need at another time. But because I could not actually interact with my data at all, I couldn't even annotate any of the reports, or there's just no way I could actually interact with my data. So I was unable to track that digitally. So yeah, so as an example, I just thought I'd bring in this lunch. So this is just 3 rice paper rolls. Does anyone want to guess how many grams of carbohydrate might be in that? 200? Anyone else? It's not a fair question, because unless you've been trained to count carbs, you wouldn't know. But I actually had this meal with a mum of a diabetic teenager, and she said, that's 15 grams. And I thought, I reckon that's 45 grams. Now, I entered that into my DIY software and discovered that it was probably, I was having sauce with it as well. It was probably at least 60 grams of carbohydrate. So again, I'm probably overstating this a little bit, but when you look at the difference between 15 and 60, that amount of insulin difference would be enough to actually put me into one of those hypoglycemic states that I couldn't recover from. So it just shows what you're sort of playing with all the time with diabetes. So this is glycosylated hemoglobin, and that's what mine was like from 2006 to 2018. This is the stickiness of proteins. So when I was showing that initial biomolecular kind of slide, you could see when the glucose built up in your circulation, it would then go and attach itself to proteins around the body, and that's where the long-term damage occurs. So this is a measure of how much the hemoglobin, how much sugar is attached to the hemoglobin molecules. And so my average would have been an HbA1c of about 8.5. Now the sort of HbA1c that's recommended is below 7. So you can see that despite being a pretty motivated patient, I really couldn't get it together. Actually, and if you look at this, what I've just thought about recently is, even though you could see that my blood sugars were, that's the average, were too high, if I shifted everything, if I just increased all my basal rates, I definitely would have had a lot more hypoglycemia, because you can see these would have just dropped down. So, okay. So innovation was thwarted for all these reasons: proprietary software and downloading cables, slow regulatory pathways. Patents, there were various things that one pump company said, we can't have that functionality because this company's got a patent on it. So in other words, I guess they weren't going to license that software or that functionality. There were fundamental usability issues. So each time a new insulin pump came out, I expected it to get smaller, and I expected it to become quicker and easier to use, like all the other bits of technology, like my iPad and my iPhone, but actually got harder to use, which is really weird. So instead of just having a few buttons to press, you'd sort of have about 8 buttons to press just before you ate a meal. So one day I actually Googled horrible state of diabetes technology, and I found this post with 118 comments. Oh, it's decided not to work. Do I go back to the laptop? Yep. Okay, the sad state of diabetes technology 2012. So that is a post by a guy called Scott Hanselman, and the fact that there were 112 people who responded to that is really interesting. If you're interested in this at all, just Google that, find that page, and you'll just read some really interesting comments from people. So here's one from Scott. Yes, that's custom cable to plug into my PDA. I'm a frustrated diabetic. It's a 15-year-old solution with no backing standards, no standard interchange format, no central cloud to store the data in. It's vendor lock-in on both sides. Blood sugar meter manufacturers are not interested in making it easy to move our data around. It's a billion-dollar industry. And this guy's really interesting. This is Ben West. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Ben, but Ben, basically he started in 2009, actually reverse engineering the protocol for his insulin pump. Because he was a bit like me, he kept having hypos when he used his bolus wizard. And I guess being someone interested in IT, security and tech, he wanted to understand how his pump was making the decisions. So yeah, he's basically said for many patients, the fidelity of their care is poor because they're prevented from empirically understanding their own therapy or ensuring its safety. I quite like this guy, Lando. The more we advance our tech, the more useless it's becoming. I sound a bit negative, don't I? Yeah, so finally, the only hope for value in the tech industry is open source. There was another guy that said, oh, let me have a look, see if I can find it. Yeah, there's a guy called Howard Look, who's now the CEO of Tidepool, which is an organisation that's made up of lots of people with diabetes, and it's actually taking their own eye controller system for do-it-yourself artificial pancreas technology through the FDA channels. And Howard pipes up in 2012. None of them have really met each other before and says, I have a dream that a smart, motivated team of people could create the perfect device, but in a way that wasn't constrained by VC funding and sought goodness, not profit. He says, it's not clear how the FDA, so that's the Federal Food and Drug Administration, approval would work, but I have to think public pressure in the face of great design would go a long way. Has anybody tried this? So John Kostick in, I think 2013, maybe 2014, no, 2013, his son Ethan was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and he managed to get his insurance company to pay for a continuous glucose monitor. So he had regular BGs for his son, but when his son was ready to go off to childcare or kindergarten, he realised that he wouldn't be able to see his child's blood sugar levels, and he was pretty anxious about that because he wanted to try and maintain the levels in that nice tight range. So that's the Dexcom transmitter and sensor on his son's arm. And his little comment that I quite like was, all the parts were sitting on the table. I needed to put them together and rob type 1 diabetes of any victories it ever thought of claiming. So he built a sort of Windows uploader. He had a laptop originally, and he started getting the data and pulling it to a Google Doc, I think. But then when his son went and played on the playground equipment or moved away from the device, there were gaps in the data. So he started thinking of how could he get that onto a mobile device his child could carry with him and then get that uploaded to the cloud. So he took a few weeks off work and he then created this Android app. And that was the beginning of a social movement called CGM, Continuous Glucose Monitoring, CGM in the cloud. There's now 30,000 members of that community on Facebook. So then he started tweeting about what he had done, and gradually more and more people saw it and wanted to perhaps use some of his tech for their own projects. There was a guy called Lane Desborough who worked for Medtronic, the major insulin pump manufacturer and one of the really big vendors. And he had a child with diabetes. He actually started work with a guy called Ross Naylor on what would become Night Scout, so a portal where people could monitor glucose and just about every other aspect of their diabetes tech online. And that was an open source project. So just trying to think, yeah. So they set up, this is, I guess, this is John Kostick's diagram of what he was trying to set up. And interestingly, once they had all of this tech uploading to the cloud, the company responsible for the continuous glucose monitor released its own share version, and then soon after its mobile version, something that wasn't nowhere near as comprehensive, but at least for a way that parents or anyone could do remote monitoring. So Michael, for instance, had access to all my glucose data for a long time. So it's just an interesting example how the FDA actually did get the company, give them a bit of a helping hand to expedite the technology through the approvals process. So this user-led movement actually had direct impact on getting tech to the wider diabetes community a lot faster than it otherwise would have. That's Night Scout, just a little bit of Night Scout. And some of these items over to the right show all of the different things that I can add in to my Night Scout site. So whether I've had exercise, how much I've eaten, what have I got there, whether I've changed a battery in my pump, whether I've just started a new glucose sensor, all of those things. It's a lot to keep track of, but it is much easier to keep track of all that stuff if it's at a glance on my phone, anytime I want it. And I can run reports from that on lots of different things, and once again, whenever I want. Yeah, just put it up there too, yep. And yeah.
The back end is MongoDB, and there are 3 hosting providers. So you can pretty much run one of these Night Scout instances yourself without understanding.
Yeah.
But there's about 6 different things you need to set up to make sure it sits there at once, so it doesn't get shut down. You notify when something goes wrong when you're on the
And you know, this map actually is quite old now, but you can just see mostly concentrated in the US, but there's actually many more countries now with people using Night Scout than what's on this map. But there was obviously meeting a huge need in the community. So now we come to my next DIY heroes. So what was happening? Look, this on the left there, that's Ben West. So Ben worked for 6 years to reverse engineer the protocol or the radio protocol on his insulin pump. So he worked out how the pump communicated or how to communicate with the pump, and thereby kind of figured out how you could control the pump. Now, I think that took him about 6 years of pretty painstaking work, including 1 year where he just decided to get out of the workforce and devote himself for the entire year unpaid to this project. So a lot of us are very, very grateful to Ben. He's laid the foundations for a lot of the do-it-yourself artificial technology, that is do-it-yourself artificial pancreas technology that came afterwards. He did approach Medtronic to try and get the protocol for their insulin pump. He also tried the FDA because he knew that they had access to it, but they said it was copyrighted. So he was unable to get it that way. So he just had to do it himself. His big thing at the moment, you know, you might have seen, I don't know if you've seen anything in the news about people hacking insulin pumps and the cybersecurity risks around it. Ben's big thing, as it would be for a lot of IT researchers, security researchers, is give us this stuff so that we can examine it and help you head off issues before your device goes to market. Both things that might impact the therapy itself and also any security flaws.
Reverse engineering the protocol, did you find bugs in there, like all vulnerabilities in that protocol? Or does he report it?
That would be really interesting. It wouldn't surprise me. Well, so I guess one of the security vulnerabilities is that all you need to know
So it's simple to brute force. And so control any pump. That's when Medtronic issued a firmware update.
Did that break this work?
So newer model pumps are fixed. There's a series of pumps that were subject to a firmware update. If you've applied the firmware update, you can no longer use them for looping. If you haven't applied the firmware update, then you can still control them. So it's a black market or a grey market.
Yeah, don't upgrade.
You can't downgrade.
So that's an invidious division for patient fees. So while I have an insecure pump, which I can use, for a secure pump, I can't use, neither of which is what I want. What I want is a secure pump, I can use.
And that's the great dilemma.
And that's where you weigh up your own individual risks. So for me, it was a no-brainer because my diabetes was a much bigger risk than some very, very vague chance of someone hacking my pump.
Especially since you have to be within a small radio range.
But it is why a lot of people won't do it at the moment. And it certainly took me about 4 months to find an old pump. Yeah.
But there's no commercial incentive. In fact, there's a commercial disincentive because it essentially cannibalizes the pump company's ability to sell their own control and algorithm, but also it opens them up to risk if a third party is controlling their device. Will they be on the hook for flaws in the protocol, etc., etc.?
And finally,
yes, except, so the system I'm using at the moment is Android APS, and it can be used with brand new combo pumps, AccuCheck combo pumps, and there's a company called, I don't know the actual name of the company, but the pumps are called Dana RS pumps, and they're coming out of South Korea. And they've been pretty much designed to be interoperable pumps, and South Korea is really interesting in what it's doing. I think with its pump manufacturing and device market, they are producing these pumps, and they can be used with Android APS. They've also got a big subsidy on the continuous glucose monitoring devices, so a lot more of their population can jump in and start using the best technology. In America, I was going to get to it in a bit, but there's also Omnipod insulin pumps, which don't have all the tubing that I've got on mine. I've got this sort of tubing that has to sit under the body, under the skin. The Omnipod little patch pumps, and that, okay, so it's still in the DIY space, but their brand new pods can be used with one of the other solutions, which is called DIY Loop. And I'll talk a bit more about Tide Pill, but yeah, there's a whole bunch of solutions that will be either commercial off-the-shelf solutions or new pump solutions that will work with DIY devices. Just checking how I'm going for time. That's okay. Okay, so let's have a look. So this is really interesting. So Ben's worked out how to communicate with the pump through painstaking effort. And then these guys, this is on the right is Scott Lebrand and his partner Dana Lewis. And Dana is a highly sought after keynote speaker, and she talks to people about how she built her artificial pancreas. She was someone who kept her blood sugars in as tight a range as possible. She had access to an affordable continuous glucose monitoring system through her private health insurance. And so what happened with her was that she was just often woken up in the night because of her blood sugars becoming dangerously low. But the problem was that with that Dexcom receiver that I showed you before, the alarms were sort of set just to be only, well, I wouldn't say barely audible, but for a heavy sleeper like Dana, those hypoglycemia alarms just didn't wake her up. So she was dying to find a way to create her own system to actually increase the alarms. Now, she found John Kostick's tweet about how he was doing the uploading of his device into the cloud, and then she ended up with Scott developing some sort of, I've probably got all the details written somewhere, but they actually developed their own software, sort of involving a Linux machine. I get a lot of the details of the tech wrong, but whatever she did was using John Kostick's information to get those, to set her own volume of alarms. She also set up a sort of, an escalation for alarm. So if the alarm went off and she didn't respond, it would set a louder alarm, and then if she still didn't respond, it would send an alert to her mother eventually. And then when she met Scott, she started giving him all the alerts. And then I think when they moved in together, the story goes, he's a really light sleeper, so the opposite of Dana. So he was hyper motivated to help her avoid hypos to begin with. And one of the first things that people notice often, most people, when they go onto one of these do-it-yourself looping systems that I'm going to tell you about, is that they have really good sleep again. So then they had this alerting system, and then, you know, being techies, I guess Scott and Dana then started getting Dana to put into this app or whatever they'd created the fact that she'd eaten some glucose. So then anyone who was doing any remote monitoring of her also got feedback that she had sorted out, she'd taken action to sort things out with her diabetes. And they wrote a bit of an algorithm then to look into the future and actually start doing predictions on what would happen based on what the blood sugar had been doing and the actions she had taken by eating or whatever. So you've got these alarm systems plus this sort of very basic diabetes monitoring algorithm. And then they met Ben West, and I think that was in 2014 at D-Data. I don't know if that was Stanford, but it was a diabetes patient-led data exchange or tech exchange event. And Ben was demonstrating his reverse engineering, his project. It might have been called DecoCare. And then they kind of realized that if he could actually control the pump with what he'd developed, if they added their algorithm, sort of combined their algorithm or used his, I guess, his code to then enact their algorithm, they could start controlling the insulin pump to give either an increased basal rate or a decreased basal rate of insulin to effectively control Dana's blood sugars as they went up or down. She started using that system overnight, and I think she woke up one morning and just felt really strange because she realised that her blood sugars hadn't gone up or down all night, and she'd had a really good night's sleep. And she loved it so much that she just kept using that system during the day. Now, it was still, I think it was still hobbled together with cables, because I think back then they just had that G4 Dexcom system, which still, well, it wouldn't have been cables, would it? I'm trying to think what it looked like, but the early do-it-yourself artificial pancreas was born, and I don't have a photo, unfortunately, but there were lots and lots of pieces, and people had to carry little small bags, I think, to cart the thing around. But we're all pretty desperate, so people did it. So, of course, at the end of 2017, I think I was due for an insulin pump upgrade, and when I saw the pump I was due to upgrade to, I was told it would never be loopable, and it was bigger than any other pump I'd had, and it was harder to use. And I just actually burst into tears. It was more shock, just utter shock. But it was really good because it led me straight back to the We Are Not Waiting movement. And Michael had been actually trying to tell me about this, the progress in this area for a couple of years, but he used acronyms. Like whenever he'd say Open APS, I thought it was just some other acronym that he used at CSIRO. And eventually I was like, oh my God, you were talking about this whole movement. So we started ordering the bits and pieces we needed for our DIY APS. I started using CGM, continuous glucose monitoring. You can see I've actually stuck a big patch over it. And the reason I do that is because if you use those for 7 days, the sensor is $92 with no refund in Australia for adults. and we just patch them and try and keep them going as long as we possibly can to make them affordable. There's two components there, and the component on the top is the transmitter, and that's $530, and they'll last for 3 months. And we sort of find ways to try and extend that as well. But CGM made a big difference already to my blood sugars. So that will show you, that's a 24-hour period where I've just got blood glucose meter readings. And you can see that level on the left, sort of between about 3.9 and 10, or that range is that healthy range. So if you look at that, it looks as though I'm actually, my diabetes control, glycemic control is actually not too bad. But if we add the CGM data, you can see what was happening in between those blood sugar readings. So the CGM, or continuous glucose monitor, does an interstitial glucose reading, which lags about 10 minutes behind your actual blood sugar, but it does those readings every 5 minutes. So this really much more complete picture. And so because I was using a CGM, oh, hang on, I did the wrong one. Whoops, getting ahead of myself there. But see, because I was wearing a CGM, that's actually interesting that I didn't head that hypo off, but I can actually set alarms to tell me when my blood sugar is actually trending down, and I can take corrective action. So maybe I did, maybe that hypo would have been right through the floor, but because I had the CGM, I was able to, probably had too much sugar by the look of that. But down below, yeah, you can see another night. So it's 2 nights in a row. Now, if you look at that, I've gone to bed there with a blood sugar of about 8. And this night I've gone to bed, blood sugar of about 7, I think, or 6. So they're both kind of acceptable. And I've done the right thing as far as I know. I've told the pump how much food I'm eating. I don't know what happened, but this is very typical. Whereas one night I had probably a bit of too much of a bump here, but that's what the first night looked like. And the other night was this complete and utter disaster. And anything could have happened. But if I didn't have a CGM to alarm me, or I didn't set my alarm to wake me up overnight, I would never have known that my blood sugar was getting to these really dangerously high levels. I'd say I've taken an insulin injection then to sort out the high, but it's actually ended up sending me a bit low. That just shows you that CGM certainly can be quite useful. There's Michael building open APS for me. So we've got our little components here. That is actually an Edison, and there's an Explorer board that it's attached to, and our little lithium battery there to keep the whole thing powered.
So that's the board is attached to is a custom design board to provide the radiator conditions.
Yeah, so unfortunately, this little Edison is no longer manufactured. So people are now using Raspberry Pis to set this up, but they're a little bit bigger. And this is just the way mine was set up, because I did online looping. It would have been set up differently if it was offline. So this is what my Dexcom app display looks like. And then this is what my Night Scout display looks like on my mobile phone. What you can see, of course, is blood sugar's going up. The algorithm has kicked into action. It's put my insulin up there. That's my basal rate of insulin going up, and it's brought my blood sugars nicely down. Whereas in the past, they would have just kept going up. There's my old pump. Very fortunately found a pump that had only been used for a year, even though it was 10 years old technology. So yeah, Bluetooth, I guess, from my CGM to the app, and then the internet connection mic to get that up to Night Scout, and then again, you describe it. You'll all know what it is. But yeah, then it's radio controls between this and the pump, correct?
Stuff going all over the place. So the CGM data goes from the here to the app on the mobile phone. That app sends it to the desktop cloud. Night Scout is running a little thing to pull in the data from the desktop cloud and combine it with the other information that you put in there. And then the rig is talking to Night Scout. doing Wi-Fi or hotspotting the internet, getting the data out of Nightscout, running a tablet, and then controlling the pump. So really the central point of control is Nightscout. And is that sort of just bespoke protocols in each one and sort of structured up that kind of stuff? So yeah, proprietary for all the XCOM stuff. Yeah. And then Nightscout, yeah, that's one invented. It's open source, but it is just some invented thing. One of the wrinkles there is that all these devices are not designed to be time zone aware or anything like that. So while you can set the clock on pump, for example, pump has no idea what time zone you're in. So all these different systems, including Nightscout, are doing this sort of get these timestamps and convert them to the right time zone. Now, usually, so if we're living in Brisbane, +10, the server, the Nightscout server, that's been running in the US, so it's running in a different time zone. So getting all these timestamps online, because there is no standardization on all the software, has been quite a nightmare. And so only earlier this year, they finally patched Nightscout to fix the timestamp stuff properly. It didn't cause a problem for people in the US because they were pretty much in the right time zone all the time. For us, because we were out here, it caused all sorts of problems. So there are all these readings from the future, which were confusing various algorithms for part of the day, but not for the whole of the 24-hour period.
So while we were on the next day.
Well, we're on the same day.
Yeah.
That's it. Now, period. But then the second thing after we're
So they go fine. What happens when you find fine? And
yeah.
And well, I mean, there's two problems. One is the technical problem about what's going to be. The other one is the biological problem of actually just getting rid of
Yeah, so all your body rhythms are out of whack and all that, and suddenly all your eating time shifts and all that sort of stuff. So there is a recovery period. Dana will start a huge amount of travel, and she has all the strategies for dealing with that. But pretty much you muddle through and you just deal with. So, I mean, just like your body muddles through jet lag.
You get to figure out and have all the time. You say my breakfast is at 4 in the afternoon. Oh, 10 in the afternoon.
Yeah. So the problem, the biggest problem with this is that the pump doesn't directly change time zone. So you change the clock on that. But Nightscout has been configured to know what time zone you're operating in, so you have to tell it.
The paradoxically, as you do that, you find one daily. Not only does the pump not know the body doesn't know, but maybe it's not a bad thing, you know, and then you have this kind of jet lag where you're going,
yeah, because it's based on alerts, what your body actually doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It should be able to deal with
That's what I was going to say. Look, even with those, and for a start, they've been solved now by the latest release, all done by volunteers for of Nightscout. But the other thing is, it worked, and it worked really, really well, and it worked way better than anything I'd done for 38 years beforehand. So, yeah, it wasn't like it was sending me hypoglycemia, because as you said, Jim, it was just reacting to the new information every 5 minutes. There is a feature I'm going to tell you about in a minute that was, I think, was probably a little bit affected by it, but fortunately didn't make much of a difference. So here's a Nightscout web portal. You can see all this lovely detailed information I've got. You know, I've got my blood sugar graph here. I've got my prediction lines here, very useful. And then I've got what the insulin's doing. So when you think about those early days where we just had that one long injection a day, you can see why it was always pretty tricky. Sorry? Yeah, give me an example. What do you mean? What? About to do? Yes. I was going to get to that, but yeah, you can definitely. So what I do, if I'm going to go and do a park run or something like that, I'd wake up in the morning. I will get to another screen where I'll show you how I did it with OpenAPS. But what you do is, in that instance, you would set a higher blood glucose target. It's a bit of a workaround, but what you're doing is saying, look, just give me a bit less insulin, because you don't want all that extra insulin or your regular amount of insulin sitting around, because as soon as you start exercising, your blood sugar is going to drop. So ideally, if I actually set that for an hour before I start exercising, I could exercise without going low, but often I'd still need to have glucose with me and I might need a bit of a top up. And parents and like a lot of people have actually set that up, I think, using calendar and things like that. If they know they've got, like if they've got a child who's got a regular aerobics class or regular PE class at a particular time of the day, they can actually set those temporary blood glucose targets. And OpenAPS is really clever because if you set a high BG target, it also, high BG also decreases sensitivity, and low BG actually increases sensitivity. So one gets the system a bit more aggressively and the other gets it to act less aggressively. And why the BG target is awesome is that it's still safe. So whatever, like a 4.5, I wouldn't like to be walking around with a 4.5. I'm not actually meant to drive at 4.5. But if I've set a target of 4.5, it's generally because my blood sugar is sitting around 9 or 10, and I know I just want it to bring me down. Different commercial solutions will deal with that in a different way, but yeah, you can do things like that. Or another example, I always hate thinking about this because to me it just spoils the spontaneity of life. But say you're eating a giant protein meal, we know that protein doesn't start working as quickly as carbohydrate. And yet protein can still be broken down into glucose. So what a lot of people are doing who are real super users is estimating how many grams of protein they're about to eat and then telling the system they're having half that amount of grams in carbs, but not for an hour into the future. But we can also click on this little OpenAPS pill, and if I click on that, I get all the information about what the algorithm's doing. And I find that really, really useful. We've got information about, this tells us when we might need to change our insulin site or our continuous glucose monitoring site. We get deviations from what's expected. We can tell how much insulin we've got on board, which is really, really useful. And the best thing is it's there whenever I want it. And we can run reports. There's a whole lot of menus up here where we can run all sorts of really cool reports. And this is just designed by people with diabetes. It started John Kostick's very first blood glucose number plus an arrow for his little 4-year-old son. And then all these people, you can even see it on Twitter, they're all saying, hey, why don't we add this? Why don't we add that? So it's really interesting to just think about this as a system that's been created by people with diabetes themselves. And this was the effect on my glycosylated hemoglobin, and that's that sticky blood sugar thing that predicts long-term outcomes. And you can just see that. That's my 8.5 over decades probably. Started OpenAPS and actually dropped within the first 2 months, actually first 6 weeks, I did a check on it and it was down to 6.8. And now my HbA1c is between 6.1 and 6.5, which is spot on. And this is what it really means. And it's why I'm so excited for people who are newly diagnosed and kids with diabetes, because their outlook is, if they can afford this tech, is really, really fantastic. That's where my HbA1c is sitting now, and there's really negligible risk of developing complications. There's all the nasty list of them. And as you can see, as the blood sugars go up, you get this sort of exponential rise here. And the average HbA1c for a teenager is about 9.4 in Australia. So that's my ambulatory glucose profile. That's a report I can run from my Dexcom Clarity app. I can get a similar report from that Night Scout. And that's the 3 months prior to looping. That shows you what my blood sugars are doing. With the 50%, sort of the mean blood sugar there, and up to 10% there. And you can see how beautifully that's come into range. That's just the first 3 months of being on an automated insulin delivery system. So that's when it comes back to weighing up risks. That just feels really good to be in that sort of zone. And you have, because you've got real-time access to every bit of your data, you just feel really, really in control. They're just some more of my metrics, I guess. That standard deviation was like, yeah, that was the difference from one day to the next. And that's gone down now to about sort of almost half. Hypos, for me, I did get a slight increase, but this was a very low amount of hypos for someone with diabetes because I really disliked hypos. And just having diabetes means that you're prone to get some hypos. As you can see, this is that severe end of the hypo scale, and I have no hypos. So that original study I was talking about, where we were given our recommendations on tight glucose control, that resulted in, I don't know how much, what the percentage of hypoglycemia was, but it was a lot higher than that, definitely. And you can see this other metric here is time in range. That's that nice healthy range. I was only at 43% of the time in that range, and now I'm at about 86%. And I'll have days where I'm 100%. And that's just another pie chart way of looking at things. A nice week for me at 95%, predicted HbA1c of 5.8. And it tells you how much fluctuation you've got too. Tried what, sorry? Yeah, that's really exciting. I think the continuous glucose monitoring companies are rubbing their hands with glee, because I think people, if they can drop the price, I think a lot of people will actually start wearing them too. Yeah, there are often. It's a really good question. Yeah. So what they find is, that's why I was saying I think there's about to be this burgeoning market, is if you're prone to type 2 diabetes, you will probably have more glucose spikes. We've got parents of kids with type 1. Actually, can I just check the time? Okay. We've got parents of kids with type 1 who've got access to free CGMs wearing them, and sometimes they post the results online, and I always like to say to them, can you drink a bottle of Coke? So yeah, their blood sugar will spike up to about 12.5. Often, not everybody's, but and Scott Lebrand, who actually developed the system for Dana Lewis, he was the first one to tell me about the bottle of Coke. He said when he had eaten a meal with Coke, his blood sugar might have gone up to about 8.8 or something, but when he did the Coke on its own, he went up to about 12 millimoles. Of course, the body naturally brings it back into the zone. But there has been one person who's published a paper on basically showing that their use of open APS meant that their blood sugars were actually kept more stable than a person with no signs of diabetes whatsoever.
So if I've been told my blood is fine, my blood sugar goes up, my body is fine. That's not a problem with my insulin, my glucose balancing, my cells do want that. I'm not going to file glucose, just accumulate my liver and suck it up to the body. And so the next is, does the algorithm then overcorrect for what actually is normal? You know what I mean? So if this is oh, your pericardium has gone up, I'm desperately trying to get this down. Maybe it doesn't need to.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Because so I guess like how long do you have to be up? Well, going back to that first comment, and I think this is one of the really interesting things I do, actually the blood sugar level is of no consequence if we had a way to measure intracellular glucose, which we don't. We would never have needed blood glucose, and nothing cares about it. And the blood glucose is a secondary marker of cellular trauma or cellular dysfunction. Yeah. So if a normal person has the insulin, give them the Coke, sugar cells are fine, including my retinal cells are fine, my liver cells are fine, my kidneys fine, every cell in my body is doing hunky-dory. It doesn't need a whole bunch of sugar pumped into it just to clear the blood.
Well, but maybe, but then studies that, like for that 1993 study, they would have been based on long-term adverse effects of blood sugar. Yeah. That's what they mentioned.
No,
So they were interested in it because they know the blood sugar is carried in cells. But if the blood sugar is correlated with the adverse effects of stuff.
only indirectly is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, sure.
So the question then is, the one issue to get is the wrinkle diabetic, where it's really
I like volatile.
volatile.
Sorry. But you're right, yeah. Someone like me, actually, who wakes up in the morning with blood sugar to shoot up because I've just woken up. Yep.
You know, if normality is actually fine to have a high blood sugar level when you have pump, maybe if there's a way to monitor that, then that's the next level of sophistication. So then you can actually store it away so you're less volatile because there's more glycogen being stored. That's not being sort of eradicated because of the evil glucose.
Yeah.
So the bogeyman can take that.
That's the neuropathy and the thyroid disease are caused by the high sugar, especially the thyroid.
Yeah. Because of and the sugar does attach to the proteins. That's one of the mechanisms, and also I think maybe an inflammatory process. But you said two really interesting things though. But sorry, I want you to speak as well there. One is that it's not really normal for blood sugar to go to 12. So I think a lot of people are interested in CGMs because it might lead to behaviour change in the general population. So I think software companies would hate CGMs. And there's a whole low carb movement in diabetes too, because it makes sense if you've got something like diabetes where you can't metabolize carbohydrates, get rid of the carbs. And some people do manage to do that. And most of us who loop and use CGM, but not all, because we've got the insight into the effect of carbs, we probably are we're more careful with the carbs we eat. So I'd say number one, your sugars really ideally won't get to 12 in the first place. But also what I think Jim was alluding to before, yes, sure, your blood sugar, the graph will show it's going up, and the algorithms, I always think of it as a human or an animal, but to me the algorithm is like this crouching tiger. It's a really, really clever algorithm, and it's designed to be safe. So it doesn't necessarily leap into action, but it will eventually start outputting more insulin. But then 5 minutes later, it's got a new reading. So it's constantly recalibrating. Another thing that I do, if I'm having a mild hypo, I don't usually have strong hypos anymore, unless I've given a manual bolus of insulin for too much, which is always risky. I will eat something really fast acting, and you're right, my blood sugar will go really fast up to really control that. The system I'm using at the moment, Android APS, will automatically detect the low and automatically set a higher blood glucose target, so that actually prevents the algorithm acting strongly and assuming, yeah. But sorry, you were about to say more too. I think I might have spoken over you. Were you going to say more about?
It was just that, and that those proteins aren't still being sold.
That's right. Yeah.
The reason I'm asking this is that fascinated with some of the stuff like memory, using AI, recording the systems now, still fairly limited knowledge of how a lot of the blood functions work. And what we thought was the bogeyman is actually the secondary bogeyman. And actually, if there's a better way to get the primary one, then we can even more knowledge. So I think the work that you and the people are doing, I think it's fantastic. And I know people that are on different makes their life, as you say.
Absolutely, we're discovering a lot more. And one of the things people in this community do is they just donate, they just upload all their data into project called Open Humans, and then that's open to researchers to do studies on the body's response. Oh, great. Yeah.
I just assumed that each one pump had the blood built into it. And
Yes.
going to be out on 14 3 months.
Don't worry. I knew that would happen today, because I've had 19 years of people going, hey, that's so cool, you know, and you think in 2019 that, like, I'm an outlier with this. There's about 1,500 of us in the world doing this, about 120 in Australia. There's like way more people with diabetes that unfortunately haven't got access to this sort of tech yet. What's that, sorry? No. On this as well. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Oh no, it is. That's why this. I guess that's why this whole movement started. It wasn't, you know, we weren't grumbling about nothing. We've had the CGM that was accurate, and we've had a pump that was accurate, and the CGM, really, the first CGM that was any good publicly available was probably 2006. So really, we could have had these two things talking to each other. This is a little feature of OpenAPS called Auto-Tune, which is also very clever. It runs in the background every night if you use OpenAPS, or people who use the other two systems. There's one called Loop and one called Android APS. They can just upload their Night Scout site to this program. They can run the program on their Night Scout site, and it actually gives recommendations. So we've got this first value is that insulin sensitivity factor. This is going back some time ago, but that's the American milligrams per decilitre. I had mine set 162. One unit of insulin dropped my blood sugar by 162 milligrams per decilitre. And Auto-Tune figured out, by doing calculations iteratively, that I was more sensitive. So it suggested I go up to 170. Not only did it suggest that, but it depends how you use the systems, but I had my system set up to just automatically use whatever Auto-Tune thought my parameters should be, rather than what I had put in. There are safety caps, so I only let it sort of increase by 20% and decrease by 30%. There's a whole lot of safety measures as well for this system. So in my insulin pump itself, I've got a manual maximum bolus rate set, or maximum bolus amount set. There's a range of other safety parameters. I actually have a slide if anyone's interested on it. But this is just such a great help in diabetes, because I guess this is what the endocrinologist would do, or what you would do yourself as a patient, but it's actually telling me my carb ratio, that I really only needed 1 unit of insulin for 16 grams of carb instead of 15. This changes a lot day to day, because it really is still based on your carb count and how accurate you are. But the basal rates, this is sort of what I had my pump set to. Gee, I had them all the same at that stage, which is really weird. And it was suggesting something a little different. So it was actually using these values to run my pump or my algorithm. But every few days I would log in. It was through Terminal or SSH, log into my rig, run Auto-Tune to see the recommendations, and then I'd gradually tweak my settings just one at a time and watch it for 3 days. So that's how I was able to really, really fine-tune those settings, just by very carefully making the changes. The hypoglycemia fear is pretty well sorted out now. So just to give you an example of how software can make a difference, that's my Dexcom app, which I love. That just sits on my phone. It's a lovely, clean app. But if I looked at that as someone who was nervous about having a hypo, even though Michael might have tried to reassure me that this was leveling out, to me that just looks like it's going to keep going down. So more times than not, I would probably go and eat something to try and bring my blood sugars up a bit. But if I've got Night Scout, I mean, look, we're not hyper vigilant all the time, but while I was learning to trust the system, I would look at it and I've got my blood sugar here. I know that it is going down, and anything below 3.9 is a hypo. But if I look at this, I can actually see the insulin has been switched off the last hour and a half. I can see how much insulin on board I've got. It's a tiny amount, but that's still that amount still affects me. I can look at the prediction lines, and I wish I could tell you exactly what they both mean off the top of my head, but I know that this is the most likely thing that's going to happen to me. And even in 15 minutes, this line would have changed slightly. It's constantly recalibrating its predictions. But this tells me that my blood sugars are likely to level out at just below 3.9. Now, if I want even more information, I click on that OpenAPS pill, and this is telling me what the algorithm's calculations are. And it is telling me that I need 2 grams of carbohydrate in the next half hour to avert a hypo. Now that's tiny. So my thing is, right, if I've got to drive somewhere, if I've got a work deadline, I'll probably eat a little sugar cube or something just to bump it up a bit. If I'm at home watching TV and I don't have to do anything, I'll probably just keep watching it because I've got the reassurance now from the system that I'm not going to drop low. Auto send, so it's just one of the features of OpenAPS. It automatically detects sensitivity changes. It looks retrospectively over the previous hour's data, 8 hours data, and compares it with 24 hours. So it can deal a lot more effectively with hormones, insulin pump sites. It's really clever. If you do a new infusion site, it resets its sensitivity calculations to 0 and starts again, because we get quite a lot of variation from site to site. If you're sick, you'll become insulin resistant, so it will start to ramp up the insulin, stress, or life itself. And again, we have safety caps set, so there's only so far it can actually adjust your settings. You were asking before about exercise. This is how I used to interact with my OpenAPS, and I loved it because I only had 2 clicks to do just about anything I wanted to do with my diabetes. So it seems like we've got all this painstaking data, but if you can control it with a couple of clicks, it's actually quite easy. So I'd wake up in the morning. What am I doing there? Wake up in the morning and decide I'm going to go to parkrun, and I would hit the exercise tab, and it's going to set my blood glucose target to be higher. If I have a hypo and I eat 1 glucose tablet, I've set this shortcut up to add that into Night Scout, and that is so that AutoTune has the correct data to work with. But that automatically is also set up to raise my BG target to prevent the system ramping up the insulin when it sees the glucose going in. I can quickly tell that I've done a pump site change or a sensor change. I can add carbs really quickly. That's if I want to add them fairly precisely, I can go into that calculator. Bolusing, so now I've become really a lot more accurate in my carb counting. In the past, I was always worried about having a hypo if I overestimated carbohydrate, but now I can sort of look at that, the rice paper rolls, and say, look, it's going to be 50 grams of carb, but I'll only do a partial insulin bolus or injection because I know I've got, can't control this, the dynamic carb absorption algorithm sitting there again like that kind of crouching tiger, and it's going to wait for that food to kick in and then start delivering more insulin. It can do it via temporary basal rate increases, or I've now enabled a feature called super microbolus. Again, it's set up for safety. It just borrows some of the basal from the future and front shifts that, so it kind of can tackle blood sugars more quickly. And the user has control over when they want to use those super microboluses. You can set it up to only be used if you're eating carbs. You can set it up. Yeah, there's just lots of ways to configure that. This is the unannounced meals function, which I've also got ticked. That just means I'm going to make mistakes in my carb counting. If my blood sugars are telling the system that I've had more than I thought I had, it will actually start giving me the appropriate amount of insulin. I had other information here on how that creates a behaviour modification loop. I won't go into it now, but it's just based on having real-time access to your data, and it's an incredibly quick turnaround in your behaviours around diabetes, I found. Oh yeah, it is less demanding. I think for me, a lot of it was just around bolusing. We still need insulin, extra insulin. We need to do something to the system to let it know we're about to eat, something like that. But in the past, I had a lot of hypophagia, so I would wait till I started eating before I'd bolus, for example. And it's a really dumb idea because the food acts within 15 minutes and the insulin doesn't peak for 75 to 90 minutes. This system, by doing that behaviour, this system would have already detected that I'd eaten something, so it would already be treating me. So then if I go on bolus late, I could end up hypoglycemic. It really sorts you out pretty quickly. And yeah, there were just a few things. Yeah.
I'm going to exercise in an hour or so. It shifts the whole way that you think about it, because you're not thinking about what do I have to do. You're thinking about my daily activity, and that user experience shifts that I think that we observe after those are set up. I guess that's what I was sort of alluding to before. So you've done the work done so far, fantastic advantage in terms of monitoring, maintaining, monitoring the work. But I don't have to press those buttons in my body. I don't have an app that I'm having a coffee. My body does it for me. But where I was kind of alluding to is, next phase.
The next 5 years.
Yeah, is there something we can do to start making these buttons unnecessary? So
Oh yeah,
then you become a normal person with a automatic.
And it does that. So it's like some of those are easy. Like you were saying, the people who've got scheduled exercise,
and location specific. I've arrived at the gym.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that when, rather than slavishly country glucose will go down, maybe something like glucose actually don't get that. Don't give them a massive dose before the hypo. Actually, that's okay. You know what I mean? Because the person will do that. So this is what I was alluding to before. So the sense that the algorithms can then become more like my body would do.
Exactly what the other
Exactly. Yeah. You go, oh yeah, just that day. No worries. Don't need a panic.
Yeah, Coke's tricky.
And then the digital delivery doesn't always.
You,
And like how do you distinguish one thing that like the Coke can cause a spike, but other things can too, and they have different long like medium
Yeah.
So the other go for it. Like maybe this doesn't really bad news.
Yeah.
And suddenly become stressed, and the medium term effect can be different. So you have to pick up like you can't take a body for example, you've got other hormones suddenly going. Yeah. There's not other signals. Yeah. You don't like that. Yeah. There's signals. But people are starting to do machine learning on these stuff.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. Really exciting on that stuff. And then, you know, when I started medicine, this is on the sky. And we were having check the other day about what I've seen. There's no 1 hour. In fact, I mean, you shouldn't be here.
oh yeah, I didn't think I would be here. I thought I'd be dead when I was 35.
So we have some really two things really easy to understand how fast we can do. The other one is really
Yeah, sorry. Honestly, look, you would have got someone else who might have painted a much easier picture. I was someone who struggled. I'll have a real pancreas any day, as fun as this is. But just so to make a point though, there are people who just I mean, we still want to know when we did our side change and our sensor, because we have to fix those are low-tech things that have to be replaced in order to keep the system running. But there are people who use this technology without even telling it that they're eating carbs. The low carbers are a classic example. A lot of people that can keep their carbohydrate consumption really low have found that they just don't need to tell the pump anything. It can just cope with it. Not everyone's system is different, and my basal rates are tiny, my insulin needs tiny. I've been unable to do that because I need so much more insulin for carbohydrate or for even protein than I do just keep my body running. It's a different equation for me, but the other part to that is fast-acting insulin. So at the moment, we're still stuck mostly with Humalog and Nova Rapid. We've got Fiasp, but that's proven to be a little bit of a fizzer. We've got another insulin that's coming to market now that's got a vasodilator in it that should be 30% faster. So I guess if we can also get quicker insulins in, we might be able to get the responses happening really fast. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see where all that goes, because the less you have to interact with it, the better, in my opinion. I was surprised that the duration of insulin action I now have programmed into my pump is 6 hours. It was 3 for those years. That's because when you've got a looping system, the little tail of the insulin, it becomes important. The last bit of insulin as the insulin peters out is still powerful. I've already spoken about my insulin sensitivity factor. I discovered I was a lot more insulin sensitive than I thought. I actually lost a bit of weight, which really surprised me, because you think if you have had high blood sugars, people tend to lose weight. So I thought if I had my blood sugars back into that neat sort of control, I would start gaining weight. But it's more that I guess the insulin's working more efficiently. And most people find they need less insulin and they have less hunger cravings. Now, if my blood glucose is over 10, which it was for half the day before, I know that something needs adjusting in my system. There's some low-tech issue generally. I needed a small amount of carbohydrate to treat hypos. Downsize, you're a cyborg, you're wearing stuff. I'm jumping to the bottom because it's sort of, the elephant in the room, access and affordability. Insulin pumps about $10,000. I get that through my private health insurance, but for people who don't have private health, fortunately these days we want a lot of people want old insulin pumps. You could generally maybe find one of those if you look. It take months and months to get one, and it's not ideal to use an out-of-warranty pump. The CGM in Australia, again, look, I probably spend $3,000 a year on the continuous glucose monitor, and that's on top of all the other diabetes expenses for the consumables for the other bits and pieces. I mean, we've got America. I'm getting sidetracked, but I did promise to mention America and other areas of the world where insulin's not affordable for a lot of people. So very sad situation. We've got young people dying in America because they've come off their parents' insurance or their parents not working. They can't afford the hundreds of dollars a month that their insulin vial costs them. So we're very lucky in Australia. We've got access to the insulin, we've got access to the test strips, and they're all subsidised. But I'm very aware in a way that we're talking about a fairly privileged group. But still, it's hard, So there was a lot of tech burden in the early weeks. I had Michael, but a lot of people don't. I've got to say, I subsequently, the communications between my rig and my pump broke while Michael was overseas for a couple of weeks. So I decided that I would build one of the other systems, which is called Loop. It's an iPhone system, and I'd heard that Loop had really great, easy documentation for non-techies. And it was actually, I wouldn't say easy, but it was just follow the steps and I could do it. But there was that tension when we couldn't work out what was happening. And for someone like me, there's a lot I want to try now, a lot of new tech I want to try, but it becomes like a part-time job for those few weeks or months that I'm learning the system. The new diabetes perfectionism, we alluded to it before. Look, it's mostly a positive thing. It'll probably drive people on to develop better and better solutions. But each time I kind of feel like, wow, we're there now. We can all relax. We've got this great tech, but there's a little bit of when you're looking at your data all the time, it's very easy to see, we were talking about that 12, the spike of 12 coming back into range, people to obsess about their diabetes. And then, as I've got at the bottom, the low-tech issues still creep up, like a bad pump site, or someone's allergic to the adhesive. Some people can't wear stuff. Not everyone wants stuff stuck to their body. So yeah, it's never going to be the panacea for everybody.
How does that manifest in kids who started with this? Like, because they haven't come from the same 300 decisions we make when you start having.
Yeah.
So you're used to making 300 decisions. Now the decisions you're making different, but you're still making 300 decisions. Do you think that's because you're used to it? Or your kids who are starting off on this stuff will sort of be a bit more aware about it, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting because there's a couple of key times. If you're a really young kid, you're not controlling your diabetes at all.
True.
And then there's a transition where your parents have to back off and you take it on, and that's a transition.
Yes.
And
But
then
like anything in life, what you take up is going to be very strongly influenced by what they were doing for you. So you're probably going to do it in a similar way to how they were doing it for you.
I think if you're using this sort of tech, then that will be an easier transition.
Yeah. But we should reduce the number of 16 to 18-year-olds who want to be because.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah, and they'll be handling their diabetes in a different way because they haven't gotten used to the disciplines that you learned early. Because you have to do it sort of handling, really critical decisions and big spikes and stuff.
But I think, if you're a 14-year-old or 15-year-old, you're already in that transition.
Yes.
And then you're diagnosed and this tech is available, then possibly it's an easier entry.
It depends. Yeah, that group.
There's a whole lot of
Yeah. 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 Look, I think we're going to see a massive change. And one of the things that a lot of us are excited about is that there is going to be this group in a few years that have only ever known this tech. Yeah, it's really cool. And there's been a study just published recently on these kids, and their HbA1c has dropped. They're sticking with the tech once they move from childhood to teenagehood. I think at this point coming into it at age 18 or 19, now every person's different, but there still seems to be a reluctance to wear stuff. And this is where the pump companies need to start making smaller devices and sexier devices, and it's not impossible. More integrated. So we're still not there yet, but it's coming. Sorry? Yeah, this one's meant to be waterproof. The old Medtronic, but I wouldn't trust it because this is a really old pump I've got now. The Medtronic pumps aren't waterproof, but there are new ones that are available for looping with Android APS and Loop that are waterproof. CGMs, yeah, they just stay on all the time, but they do get a bit waterlogged. But yeah, I think the study that's been done on that on the children and teenagers is looking very positive, and my feeling is as soon as we get a commercial solution that is good on usability, affordable, and I just think once we get the looping done in an off-the-shelf way, it'll take off. Teenagers aren't stupid. They're gonna love this and they won't have to think about it. I don't have to think about this. I don't have to think about it 300 times a day anymore. We've got a great community. I've been involved in organising a couple of build parties. We get together. Nobody builds the device for anybody. This is the first ever looping build party in London in 2017. But it's really fun to get together with a bunch of people that are fascinated by this stuff that no one else would generally be interested in at all. And yeah, we just sort of help each other out. That's Anna, who lives in Brisbane, helping someone. We generally communicate via Gitter or Facebook. So there's always someone there 24 hours a day. If you've got a query when you're setting up your system, there's Matt. Where's Matt? He's been looping since the early days, so he was carrying around a whole bunch of stuff stuck together. Where are we now? We've got 3 systems. I talked to you about OpenAPS that requires an extra rig. There's our lovely loop system, which you can actually bolus and do everything from your phone. iOS, GUI there. That does require this little thing. This is called a Riley link, which is quite small and neat. It's a bit like the Edison, and that is that go-between, I guess, the radio, or it translates, what would it translate? I guess app talk or phone talk into pump talk. So that's an extra thing to carry around. If anyone wants to look at it, I've got my little Android OpenAPS rig here. But the new system I'm using is Android APS. And Android APS I've got, let's just see if I can even bring it up here. Yeah, well, my blood sugar's done a few funny things today, but I've set a high temp target because I was nervous, so I didn't want to have a hypo, but it's still a lot safer than what I would have done years ago. I've pretty much got what I've got on Night Scout, only I've got it here as the app itself, and Android APS doesn't require any external components, so the algorithm lives on the phone itself.
So when you pop into the EV,
Yeah, that's a good question. Depends on whether you're conscious or not.
no,
You're
you're not.
not. Well,
The standard thing, so we had this with standard thing for hospital issue, coming to the pipeline, they say we want to control what we want to do, we want to control the diabetes, telephone, but that was, probably 15 years ago. My experience with various conversations with clinicians over that time is that the knowledge of this technology, even just having pumps, is very limited.
I've got a friend who's an anaesthetist. He reckons it'd be awesome, but that's just what he says to me. I'm not his patient. And we've.
So that's the other thing. I mean, the roles don't sure your what about the roles in the range of other things like people around going to any other other space things you all those other things I think there's a and the more people that use the more functions, less expensive it becomes for people who use the primary.
Interesting to put CGM on the lead athlete.
Yeah.
But
particularly people like doing ultras and stuff who do have to manage blood sugar really carefully. So they carry these active gels and they time and make it happen. Yeah. That would be really interesting. They're still smallish group of people, wonderful from the research point of view. Yeah. But in terms of mass marketing, I mean, the research
I think it'll, be really.
I think it should be.
Well, that's a really. I don't know of any type 2 that's using this, but I see no reason why they couldn't. And this will be the next big boom market. Like, I'm really surprised. I think people know it, but they're just not saying it. Would probably have to pay out of pocket to get an insulin pump. But for instance, in South Korea, that's now subsidising continuous glucose monitoring. They give a 70% off the cost for anyone with type 1 diabetes. They tried to get that also for people with type 2 who are on insulin. So not all type 2s are on insulin to begin with. You do get different people with different presentations of diabetes though too. So newly diagnosed people are quite interesting because sometimes their pancreas is working a little bit, but in that honeymoon period, that's actually quite awkward for them to use any of these systems, but they're still helpful for them. But, yeah. trick.
So you put it on them for a while, you get the cover, and you go, oh, you can drop it.
Yeah. I think you're going to end up with one of these.
No,
No, it's because of your enthusiasm. But yeah, look, I think I think another thing though is that this could be incredibly useful in hospitals where there's a lot of insulin errors. I think there's so many things where even if someone wasn't a looper all the time, I mean, you'd have to get their parameters right. But given, again, no one would maybe want to do it for liability, but there's so many errors at the moment that it's got to be better than a sliding scale. Liability. Yeah. Yeah, a lot. What we're finding now, even for people showing up with that to the build parties, is there are a lot of people who don't have that understanding of their diabetes, and so yeah, it's more health literacy issues as well. So if you've got someone presenting and they have no idea how much insulin they really need, I mean, they're not going to do as well normally, but putting all of that into a looping system, it's probably still okay because of the safety parameters. But anyway, I'll just quickly try and get through the last slide, sorry, but that's just my friend Anna. She actually runs her Android APS system directly from her Android watch rather than a phone. So where are we now with the tech? Ben West, who is that original hacker that hacked the Medtronic pump, he talks about high fidelity treatment. So now the effort we put in, we get the rewards. It's great. Before we had low fidelity, we'd put in a lot of effort and some people got rewards, but a lot of us didn't. We've got a commercial closed loop in Australia at the moment, the Medtronic 670G. It's the very first commercially available closed loop system. It's actually quite powerful, but it's got some really unfortunate usability issues, possibly because it's the first in the market. But they actually found out that 40% or 38% of people stopped using it during the trial because it annoyed them so much. I'm sure Medtronic's next system will be better, and that might come out in a year or two. There's another system called Diaboloop that's out in Europe that's getting quite good reviews. And then we're waiting on these systems. There's Tandem Control IQ. It's meant to be coming maybe in about a year. We'll get a system called Basal IQ in Australia in the coming months, which will at least will go a long way to preventing hypos, but it won't be dealing with the highs. Bigfoot is another company using a Freestyle Libre flash glucose monitoring system. Beta Bionics, they've actually got a product, they've got a few products, but in the pipeline, I guess, or in trials, but they're actually looking at a dual hormone system, so not just insulin, but glucagon to actually bump the sugars up. Omnipod Horizon is another one. So it's all coming in the next couple of years. FDA is now, they're saying that they're really interested in having interoperable components. And then that just raises issues about if you have a problem, who do you go to for help, you know? But that's not insurmountable. So you might have a different CGM, a CGM from one company interacting with a pump from another company, and then the controller, the app or the iController, the algorithm itself will be from someone else. So, you know, I guess it's identifying when there are issues and how you solve those issues will be interesting. But at least FDA is saying that they're interested in giving people choice. So they've developed these new categories, the iPumps or ACE pumps, so alternative control enabled pumps. So a pump that could be controlled maybe by, well, definitely Loop, the iOS system is one. Hopefully maybe Android APS, which is based on the OpenACE APS algorithm, will be able to control these ACE pumps. The Tandem T Slim has come out saying, has got ACE pump classification. And look, there's things that I'd need to investigate a bit more, but I think there are categories of iCGM and iController. And I think partly the idea is that it'll help speed things through the regulatory review process as well. Tidepool is a really interesting organisation I might have spoken about before. Some of the people who developed, like the guy that developed that Riley link for communicating, for the communications with Loop, has gone to work for Tidepool. The CEO of Tidepool, which is a non-profit, was one of the early people commenting on that State of Diabetes post, the guy that talked about creating a company out of goodwill. So they are hoping to develop something that will just be available for download through the App Store, working very closely with the FDA. They've got the Omnipod manufacturer, so that's a little pod pump, are already doing, working very closely with Tidepool. They're doing a huge study, outcome study at the moment. And they're also now, there's talk that Medtronic will allow its pumps to be interoperable with the Loop system. And a whole, I guess Tidepool's mission for the Tidepool Loop do-it-yourself artificial pancreas system is that they will partner with a whole range of insulin pump companies. There's a whole lot of stuff I haven't talked about, like there's also open source do-it-yourself CGM collectors like XStrip, and there's Meow Meow Reader, which sits on top of CGMs. There's just like this whole ecosystem of things people have developed to get around some of the awkward issues in the commercial software. I've just said here, everyone's talking about interoperability and we're all really excited about it. But from what I've seen so far, you're still locked in. It's still about business deals between companies. So I don't want to carry an Android phone at the moment. I would like to just have my iPhone. I don't want to use this pump. I want to use a nice small new pump that doesn't annoy me overnight by buzzing. It does these things that sound like electric shocks. So things like a pump was originally designed to give a vibration or a beep at the end of a temporary basal rate. So in the old days, you'd only set a temporary basal rate once a day, but now we might set one every 10 minutes. So there'll be a bit of change in development, but I guess I'm not trying to be negative. I just really want everyone to let us do whatever we want. It's not just for luxury reasons. Like if you're someone who has allergies to particular tapes, and that's really widespread, you might be stuck with an insulin pump that requires a certain cannula, which you can't use. Like, so there's all these dependencies and constraints that I hope we can overcome. JDRF, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, has developed an open protocols initiative to try and get companies to open up their protocols, and Ipsomed is one of the pump companies that signed up to that. Oh look, I just put a little thing in here, no need for the Riley link. So once we get this app through the FDA approvals process, rather than having to carry the extra components, that iPhone app will be able to talk directly to any pumps. The people involved in the DIY movement, a lot of these guys have been recruited or headhunted to industry. So we've got Ben West is now working as a product engineer for Dexcom. John Kostick is works for Beta Bionics. This guy's gone over to Medtronic, Jesus Berrien, Howard. Look, these are all the ones, some of them working for Tidepool. Huge numbers of DIY loopers have gone to Tidepool. Lane Desborough, who was there from the beginning, is now with Bigfoot. And Nate is actually the person who reverse engineered, what did he do? The Dexcom, he built Loop, basically. But Nate got out after that. I think it was probably taking up too much of his life, but he's got a job with Apple and he's involved in their health IT. We've got a group called the Open Research Consortium, which is actually led by people with type 1 diabetes and includes Dana Lewis, who built OpenAPS with her partner. So there's a lot of DIY researchers. A lot of those people don't have PhDs. It's a really interesting kind of mix that's shaking things up a little bit. Models of care in diabetes are changing. So, you know, the model I grew up with was, I went to my endocrinologist, who's a fairly highly paid practitioner with a lot of expertise, and he would spend a short amount of time with me a few times a year, helping me adjust my insulin parameters, my dosing levels. But that's not where the diabetes happens. It happens on the fly every day. So I think we'll still need, like, that's still a very valuable conversation to have. For me at the moment, I've hit just a slight wall. I've got great support from my lovely endocrinologist, but he doesn't understand the algorithm and the tech to that degree to be able to really help me fine tune things. So we're going to see CGM coaching, where I think in the future, where we have people doing remote monitoring, which raises other issues of surveillance, but helping people with diabetes in various ways through tech. Maybe you can automate some of that to actually help people learn how to perfect their systems. A lot of expertise now does rest with the patient community. We've got IT experts and security experts. We have a lot of expertise in the minutiae of daily living. We do a lot of peer-to-peer knowledge transfer in online communities and at build parties. And we have an emerging group of super users who are the ones who are competing with the gluco normals, and they're a really interesting group. The interesting things we're encountering in the community is in the early days, people developed something to sort their own situation out, stuck it up on the internet to share as open source, but there were always going to be holes in the documentation, and the sort of the community spirit was that you just had to go and work it out, and if you could work out where the gaps were, you might add to the documentation for the rest of the community. But now we're getting people sort of show up on say a Facebook page or a Gitter page and say, so how do I live? Tell me how to start. And it's really interesting just looking at different people in the community. So what will happen when we get these commercial systems, maybe a lot of people may abandon the DIY solution, but they've actually will take with them all the new learning that they've acquired. Other people will probably stay DIY because I'm guessing that they'll be able to do more. They'll be able to implement things that might be considered riskier to unleash on the general public. And it really depends how much customizability is available in the commercial systems. So the Medtronic only allows you to set your blood sugar target at 6.7, whereas most of us would want our blood sugar target at 5.5, things like that. Anyway, that's just showing this is a DIY solution on the left, and this is what the company will produce itself. It's an Android-based system. In the Omnipod system that should come out in about a year, the algorithm will live on the little, where is it? I don't know if that's a pod, that's a Dexcom. Oh, the algorithm will live on the pod, which is interesting. In the Tide Pool Loop system, the algorithm will live on the phone. So what's that going to do to the market? I guess in this system, you don't need your phone near you and the loop will still work. You just need your phone to control the system. Urgent need for affordable CGM. Anyway, that's just my little diabetes one. We got told for many years that diabetes was the leading cause of all these awful issues, and now I'm saying we've basically got the tools to stop that, and that's my happy face. And I've done a lot of talking. So yeah, it's a really positive outlook for the future. An interesting study. Got a question?
About auto-tune.
Yep.
Does it give you confidence intervals for like standard deviations or anywhere like, because it gives you these values and with the carbs to that one, you said that it changed day to day that you could give the wrong amount of carbs. Does it give you a way of saying I'm fairly confident or I'm not, and then even doing statistical tests to be like, well, you're very likely that this value should be changed to this value as opposed to.
Yeah, that's a really good question. No, it doesn't. I find that it doesn't change radically, so it might just change. The biggest one I'd noticed was 10 grams to 13. That's still quite a bit, but again, it comes down to the fact that it's changing its decisions every 5 minutes and it's able to adapt. In auto-tune, it is color-coded, so you get a certain number of stripes to show how much, it's like a trustworthiness thing, how much is of those values have been derived from parts of the day where there's no random factor, there's no eating involved, or there's no unusual changes. So some of them you feel more comfortable using. And I think the other thing is really that I don't change my underlying settings. I only do that when I trust it. And a lot of people don't use it because they prefer to select a very narrow date range where they know that everything's going to be super accurate. It's a really good question.
Context stuff.
this is what the data inputs were.
Yeah.
Not is some computer to go and complement intervals around the gap. But then the advice on how to use it is that don't just take it as is. You've had it over time. Be aware that input data may be dodgy in the last couple of days. So you're in the loop. It's very much part of the safety.
Yeah. Has anyone else got any more questions? Because I've done a lot of talking. Okay. If anyone wants, this is very old-fashioned to have a sheet of paper, but if anyone wants, this has got all the details for all 3 systems and all the information, links to everything you could possibly want. And you're very welcome to email me. I've got a website, myartificialpancreas.net, with links to a lot of this stuff as well. So if you meet someone with diabetes, you have a kid with diabetes yourself, suddenly you want to get in touch, that's one way, or through Jim. Don't hesitate to get in touch with me. And I just want to say I'm really inspired about you guys too, because you've got incredibly useful knowledge and skills going into the future with health IT. So I think whether you're in a company, maybe this might influence you to think a little bit more about the patient end of things or the user end. And I know there's different users, but or if you have anyone in your family, you may decide to embark on an open source do-it-yourself project as well and change the world. No worries. My pleasure.